Hello and welcome to episode 365 of the Crate and Crowbar. It is the 16th of April 2021. My name is Chris Thurston and tonight I am joined by Graham Smith.
Hello.
Tom Francis.
Hello.
And Alex Wiltshire.
Hello.
Is 365 a number that we mark because it's the amount of regular days in a year? This is the question that I was just asking myself while waiting for enough time to pass that we could just cancel the rest of the episode, including possibly this.
I feel like, didn't we have a podcast recently where we were saying this? Because I remember you, Chris, saying that it's enough for one podcast every day of the year, and what a terrible year that would be.
See, I was thinking that now, because now it is enough. So if I said that previously, I was wrong.
Am I in a time loop?
It's a question we've all been asking ourselves. Nonetheless, 365. Wow, what an achievement. You could now listen to an episode of the podcast every day of the year.
You could have an episode of the podcast all the way around a circle plus 5.
That's true. 5 extra for overlap. That would get you like the little like belt catch. You could print the podcast on every degree of a belt. Which I presume need to be 360 units long.
There's no other way to divide a circle.
No.
Clocks don't exist.
Shit, you're right. They do. There are enough podcasts to make a second generation Xbox plus 5.
Because we made jokes about like, oh, I know what it was. It was when we hit 360. Because we were making jokes. We made the 360 joke and saying like the next podcast would just be called Crate and Crowbar 1.
We could just go back to that if you like. That seems better than.
In a previous iteration of this time loop, I remember a good joke.
I haven't done the podcast, I think, since that episode. And so apparently I'm just going to do the same one again. if that's all right with everybody else.
Tom's just going to think nostalgically about numbers jokes.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe there's something like Xbox 360S. The S is kind of like a 5. That's 365. But no, it's nothing. It's nothing. It's less than nothing. It's garbage. Good. How are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Alex. You passed the test.
Has there been any news?
I don't think so. Actually, no, there has been. We discussed this already, didn't we?
It's going well so far.
Don't reveal that.
I wanted just to like sort of wordlessly point to the existence of Oxenfree II, and then add some words to the wordlessness, which is to say that it's cool that exists. It's cool that there's going to be one. I really liked Oxenfree. I will say the trailer they showed, I would not have been able to tell you that wasn't footage of Oxenfree 1. Like I literally couldn't notice anything different, but that's fine. It can be the same thing. I'm happy.
There wasn't a lot that I would improve about it either. You know, there wasn't anything that sort of you've had to sort of slot onto that game to make it better. Would really.
Yeah, and it wasn't like an exploration adventure game. It wasn't about like traveling the globe and seeing amazing new places. So it's not too much of a problem if it's in another blue-grey hilly area.
Forgive me and potentially forgive listeners at home. Oxenfree was the one with a radio in it.
Yeah.
Yes, and like where people could talk over each other.
Yeah,
just like I demonstrated just then. This is the Oxenfree II. No, it's not. I pretend I didn't say anything. I just wanted to clarify which game this was.
Okay, I was more or less done. I think there's.
Oh shit!
Looks the same, but that's okay. That's the summary.
We're podcasting from first principles. It's like we've never done this before. Was there any other game news announcements?
Core
stories.
Core.
What are you so impressed by, Alex?
Core. There's a new game creation sort of platformy thing that sort of makes it able for people to make the games, but people who would normally make the games to make the games. Graham, you know about this.
I feel like we're talking from first principles, not just podcasting.
Take it back a step. All right, we're going to start with breathing, and we'll work all the way up. Great.
Yeah, Core is basically Roblox with the graphical fidelity of Fortnite. Or you could say it's Roblox, but in the Unreal Engine. It's just come out in early access after a year of being in alpha. It's exclusively available on the Epic Game Store. And yeah, it's like a game creation platform and distribution platform. So you make games in it using assets you've created yourself or assets that they provide. You can make stuff in it without needing to know any programming. And then it makes it really easy to distribute that to the player base. Kind of through a sort of, I don't want to use this word, but Epic like to talk a lot about the metaverse. And it's kind of like the metaverse, like there's a hub world. I prefer to say it's a bit like PlayStation Home.
Yeah, that's what I was actually thinking. The PlayStation Homeverse.
Yeah. And I am like, there's a line in the press release for this that I wanted to mention. So like they've had 1 million players over the last year, and there's currently 20,000 free playable games that people have made for it. But the press release has the line in it: in less than a year in alpha, Core has welcomed more than 1 million players and creators to the platform, and introduced a level of disruption to game creation and play that's similar to how YouTube revolutionized video. Which is,
I hadn't heard of it till today.
Yeah. YouTube, meanwhile, is the world's second most popular website. I think they're maybe claiming that they're running when they're not yet crawling. But I have other reasons why I'm skeptical of this. Like, mainly around the fact that it does look like Fortnite. I can understand why, Roblox, but it looks better, sounds on the face of it like it should be a good, compelling pitch. But I don't think how Roblox looks is a bug. I think it's a feature. In part because it means that it runs on everything, including low-spec machines, which is really important if you want a game to be popular in countries where the population can't easily afford really expensive computing devices.
And beyond that, like I think even in the West, phones are the predominant way people play.
Yeah, it's also Roblox kind of is very forgiving. When the people who are making games in Roblox are amateurs, often very young, they're kids, they're teenagers. It kind of supports that kind of muck around creativity. Like, it doesn't matter that you don't know how to create really good high resolution textures, for example. Whereas that's not the case if your game is kind of like pitched at a level of Fortnite. Like, if you want to create an asset that sits alongside the assets created by the actual creators of Core, then you're going to have to be pretty talented. You're going to have good experience with 3D tools and texturing tools and that sort of stuff. And so that's like, you're raising the floor in a way that I think is going to exclude a lot of people. And importantly, is going to push them into creating more derivative stuff, because they're going to use the assets that you've given them and rely on that stuff more. And I think that's already true of the 20,000 or so games that are on there. Like, in this press release, they linked to a bunch of games that people have made in Core. The first one they mention is a team-based multiplayer shooter called Infinity Arena, which we'll put a link to it in the show notes. But the image of it is basically, it's just Halo. Like, it just has a Master Chief in the photo standing in a kind of grey corridor. It looks deeply uninspired, and I don't want to poop on this thing, because it's presumably created by an amateur developer who's just starting out, and recreating something you like is a perfectly valid way to go about getting your start. But Roblox is great because people create really creative and interesting things and ideas that don't exist already in AAA gaming. Whereas I feel like I feel like the visual fidelity of this is a trap, essentially, that forces people or encourages people to create slightly scruffy looking recreations of games that already exist.
I think I feel kind of a bit more ambivalent about it. Where on one hand, so is I don't know an awful lot about Core, but is the only way you access it through PlayStation Home, or is there like a web interface as well?
I don't actually know that. Like, as far as I know, there's no web interface, and it's just done through, you download the launcher through the Epic Game Store, and then the launcher is how you access the games.
See, that's the thing that I think would worry me if if I'd invested in Core, because that's one of the Roblox's great strengths, is that, you're chatting to people, you're talking to your friends, and you're on a web browser, and you click the play button, and it loads it in, and bam, you're playing. And anything that kind of, now you're going to meet up in one hub world, and then you're going to walk over to that place to do that, and that sort of friction, which kind of the kind of freewheeling kind of chaotic sort of, we're going to play that, and then we're going to play this, and we're just going to skip over to there, and oh no, they're over there, no, we'll just have to just close that down and just click on this link. That is really important to Roblox culture, and I think not doing something similar like that instant access thing, I think is a danger. On the other hand, the fidelity thing, so I agree with you, but so obviously in Fortnite already, you're able to make stuff, and Fortnite is already a place where people make stuff just to hang out with them, and just to muck around and put a bunch of stuff in a space and just mess around. And that has Fortnite fidelity as well. And if Core can capture that, then people are already doing that. So, I mean, I agree that I think it kind of prompts people to make things that are sort of, already in the market, sort of, here's my Halo and here's my war game thing. What's the Call of Duty thing that,
Warzone?
Warzone. And I think that it would prompt people to do that, but I think that it also offers people the chance to mess around, and that those people are already messing around with the same kind of looking tools elsewhere. So it actually might be an easy transition for them.
Having a look around now, just as you were talking, there is a browser interface from which you can launch games. I would be curious how quickly you can launch them, because that's the other advantage of Roblox, is that the download sizes are tiny.
Yeah, 10 seconds and you're playing usually.
Yeah, which is presumably not the case if you've made something that looks a lot prettier with its own asset set in Core.
Yeah.
But maybe these are the problems that just get solved as internet connections become faster and that sort of stuff.
And maybe the fact that you've loaded into PlayStation Home means that a lot of the fundamental, the most important core stuff is all loaded in memory already, and skipping off into a game is going to be easier. Who knows?
Just for clarity, it doesn't actually run off PlayStation Home, right?
No, just
if
off
only.
The core launcher, basically, is the core client you install. But it's got then a 3D world that you can explore, that you can then use to access game modes that have been created by the developers of Core, who are called Manticore, or by the users.
There is something about Roblox which does kind of, you have to be inventive. I mean, obviously there's a huge amount of derivative crap on Facebook, on Roblox. Almost all of it is derivative crap, but it is also a place where all these amazing kind of bizarre ideas have sprung up, often not really extended beyond Roblox, which I've eternally surprised about. But I think also a lot of the fun of Roblox exists in its jankiness, like a lot of the physics games in it. This is, Roblox physics is not physics, the physics of Fortnite and Unreal Engine. And that's why those games are fun, because they're just stupid and things don't work correctly. And that is a great source of joy. If you smooth all that stuff out and iron it and make it perfect and glossy, I definitely think that culture, which is not to say its own culture can come forward, but that culture is definitely not going to happen.
It's like you might know better than me, but it doesn't feel like Roblox has a sort of default genre. Whereas with Core, like a lot of their marketing and the trailers that they've shown are a lot of different first-person shooter game modes
Yeah,
or
that's
third-person
interesting.
shooter game modes, and then a lot of what the users are creating seem to be kind of first-person shooters or shooty bang things as well.
Really?
And so I suppose Unreal Engine is pretty well set up, obviously, given it's named after Unreal. Pretty well set up for first-person shooters, and I imagine Core gives you like weapon assets and that sort of stuff.
3 million different guns.
And so, like, it's so far at least it seems to be steering people in that direction.
I mean, Roblox's thing is
doesn't.
It's social. Like Roblox is entirely social. That's everything to it. You know, that's why I think it does have a genre, and the genre is role play. And you know, that's role play, either strict because you know people actually play their roles, or it's just a world in which you get to do what you like with your friends. You know, sometimes with a game they're in there as well, but mostly you're there just to have a laugh with your friends. And you can't really do that in first-person shooters, not in the same way. I just thought there is another bit of Unreal news that the Metahuman project, has just been launched to the wider world in beta, which is cool.
Yeah, that looks amazing. I don't have a use for it, but the videos they've shown of it being used, the fidelity level looks incredible, and those things are animated. And I hadn't quite appreciated that, like, as you're editing your person, you just make humans. It's all being like rigged and rendered in real time. Like there's not a sort of compile phase where you then have to press a button in order to see it come alive. It can just do that immediately because it's already running, which is wild.
Yeah, it's cool as hell.
I don't have a use for it either, but I just got accepted into the early access.
Nice.
I'm just going to use it to create weird looking people.
Maximum face.
Yeah.
Tom, could you ask John, your artist, to put a meta face on your characters, but it would just be an Easter egg. No one will know.
Oh God! Like from a distance, we have the normal stylized art, but if you zoom in too close, it just switches to a fully realistic human face.
Teeth.
That'll be horrendous.
Oh,
I mean, I assume that isn't this whole thing like sort of very Unreal sponsored and Unreal integrated, such that you wouldn't be able to just sort of drag and drop this into Unity?
Correct. You can export the models and into kind of Maya and whatever else, and mess around with them there. You can, I think, which means that you can export them into Unity, but you'd be breaking all the rules. And they're entirely free to use within Unreal.
I would bet that also this is the kind of stuff Unreal is kind of built for, like this super high fidelity, AAA kind of stuff. And I bet, I don't know anything about performance, but I would imagine these are pretty demanding, even in the best of circumstances. And a sort of janky export into Unity is not going to perform very well at the fidelity levels you want.
For sure. In fact, that was one of the things, because I wrote about it recently for Edge, and that was the fidelity thing is the thing that the developers are most concerned about. It is efficient. Performance, performance. It does do level of detail versions for you, just automatically generates them for you. But so far, all the images that we've seen of this are highest level of detail, close by, beautiful shots, which is entirely able to do with beautiful strands of hair and all that kind of stuff. Certainly when they first revealed it, and the level of detail stuff, which at further distances, the hair suddenly transformed model, and that transition was apparently not too good. And that a lot of G Delta stuff was definitely something that could be improved.
Yeah, they did show it in a video I saw. I think it might have been like a launch trailer or something. They did show the level of detail stuff where they just like And in a very brave way, really, because like the flattering way to show the level of detail thing is actually move the camera further away and reduce the detail as it does so at the sort of distances you normally would. But of course, that doesn't really show it, because if you're doing a job well, you can't tell that's even happening.
Yeah.
So instead, they stay full close up and let the guy go into back to PS3 graphics, back to PS2 graphics, back to PS1 graphics. You watch his face devolve into angular ridges.
I really loved that, actually. I thought it looked really cute. Like they said, you can use this for creating characters for like crowd scenes and stuff like that in the background, and yeah, that looked cool.
I want someone to use this to make a game that's entirely like that. Like it goes to all the trouble of making the perfect, meticulously detailed, photorealistic face, and then exports them all at the lowest LOD and never increases it.
Or at distance, they look amazing, and you get closer and closer, and it's like, oh dear, oh god, oh no.
I wonder if you could do one where you invert the LOD logic. So at distance, they're incredibly well rendered, but as you get closer, they get more and more angular and blocky. It's a sort of like weird psych.
Imagine this sort of thing's going to be a really amazing resource for artists generally, like storyboarders, like concept artists, previs people for movies. Like that I almost see it being more useful for that in some ways than I guess if you're making a game on Unreal, why not? Or a human directly from this. But I can imagine that just being an incredible tool to have access to.
Definitely.
For reference as much as anything else.
I think extras are going to be really quite nervous about it as well.
Right. Yeah. Just people hanging around film sets with green screen balaclavas on, waiting for their faces to be replaced by a LOD mesh from from the cloud.
Well, actually, while on the topic, let's also mention that there's this Witcher mod where somebody has used an AI to basically generate Geralt lines based on the voice acting from the game. It can be trained on the voice acting from the game and then generate the voice actor's performance, I forget his name, of some new lines that they need for their mod. And of course, this is raising questions about it's making actors nervous. I have to imagine, I don't know what the law is currently, but I have to imagine that any sensible law around this would say that you are using their likeness and you need permission to do that.
Yeah, you'd think.
And if you have their permission, then I think it's a non-issue. Like if an actor gives you permission to use that stuff, obviously an actor would be well advised to be very careful about what contract they sign there and limit the use of it. But, an example that came up in an article about this was you record all your dialogue and then something changes in the game and you're like, shit, we need to change this line, or we need some little thing here, just a very small incidental, instead of reloading, it's rearming or something like that, where you don't really need their A game and you have all their voice lines, you're working with them, you have a good relationship with them, they give you permission to generate this stuff. You could fill in those gaps just with a click of a button rather than having to schedule a whole other studio session. Because I think a lot of games, especially on the lower end budgets, are using actors who are recording from their home studios and everything, and that's obviously less of a ordeal. But if you're doing in-person multi-character scenes where everyone's got to come into the studio at the same time, that is a scheduling nightmare, I hear. And the ability to fill in those gaps seems good, but obviously situations where you're sort of not hiring actors in the first place because you can steal the performance from some other existing thing is probably not going to work quality wise for a lot of contexts, and B, definitely seems like it shouldn't be legal.
I think there was, with Back to the Future 2, there was a court case about this, which is where a lot of laws around likeness rights and stuff were first written, because Back to the Future 2, they go back in time to the same time period as the first film, and so they needed the actors back, but they didn't want to pay Crispin Glover the fee that he wanted. And so what they did was they used a bunch of footage, including cut and unused footage from the first film, and then they used a lookalike for a bunch of scenes. And just kind of pretended that he was still in the film, and so he sued the film company and said that they were using his likeness to market the film by pretending that he was in it, basically, when he wasn't, and he won. Right. And so that that set a lot of precedent around this stuff.
The thing I was going to say is it feels like the thing actors need to protect, because when you talk about not needing to call actors back in for another day in the studio to reshoot things, That's basically like not having to pay actors for another day of work
Yeah.
as well. Like that is actually part of the process, right? Like reshoots are part of the process. It's an expected, part of the way the industry functions. And so almost the thing that needs to be reflected in how this is sort of, I guess, what actors charge for is almost like the performative intent. Because I was thinking about this, that like if you go and make a Skyrim mod where you pull together all of the stuff you need out of the very generic lines of dialogue that are in the game. I imagine you could do this in The Witcher 2 to an extent. You just use sufficiently generic lines about what's that and go over there and get me this thing to pull together something a little bit rough and ready. I don't think anyone that wouldn't raise the same alarm bells, even though it's functionally the same thing, rendering some new content out of existing recorded material. The difference in that case is the recorded material that's being used is being literally it's repurposed performance that is being recreated as it was. And that is, I think, distinct from some sort of, process by which you break out the individual sounds the actor made or individual words or even like individual syllables and reconstruct a realistic performance out of them, because that is effectively new work that has been generated out of already paid for labor. And at that point, it's sort of, I think that's where it gets really tricky.
Yeah.
It's a bit like deepfakes, for example, or any other kind of way of amending a performance after the fact. I mean, I don't know if it needs to be like the law needs to move against it, but I suspect that whatever protections are in place for actors currently need to adjust to account for this probably pretty swiftly, because it's only going to become more of a thing.
I wonder if it's going to be. I mean, this is such a clear-cut case where it's trained on one voice, not just one voice actor, but one performance, and it's for a mod that is for that game where it is that character saying those words. It couldn't be clearer that this is the imitation that is meant to be read as that person. But I wonder how, if the technology already supports, or if it soon will support, train it on two different performances and combine them, and the AI version, if it can come up with a voice that sounds human that is generated from those two different performances or more than two, then now you've got something which doesn't entirely belong to either of the original people.
Right.
I wonder if how you make laws that make that work.
I don't know. Yeah, you just shout "stop it" and then.
I just don't think that's on.
No, put it down.
It make me feel bad. I just thought it'd be enough.
Spray the infringers with a water bottle to dissuade them.
Yeah, you just got to spritz them. You just got to spritz them until they settle down. You do that to an AI, shorts out. There you go. You've won.
Well, yeah, we solved that legal quagmire.
Done.
You just spritz it. Yeah, exactly. Should we talk about what we've been playing?
Yeah.
I've got one that's connected actually a little bit. Somewhat connected.
Go on. Segue us, Alex.
I'll be quick because it's a game that we've talked long about, but I've been replaying Disco Elysium.
Oh, nice.
The new voices, and I've been having a ball.
How are the voices?
They are. I'm really enjoying them. But like, I'm really interested in the effect they have. Like, I was initially sort of, we've played. I think all four of us have played it. I think.
Yeah.
I have.
So we all have a strong relationship with the game already, and we've all built up our own kind of internal models of what that world sounds like.
An inland empire of some kind.
Yeah, maybe one of those.
Yeah.
And so it was definitely a bit of a shock to start with when you're hearing new voices, defined voices for people you've got, which is always going to differ from the one in your head. But by and large, like it's been really good. And the thing that I've really found about it is that I've been reading it and listening to it better than I read it the first time round. I'm not particularly good at reading video game text. I tend to skip over it, read too quickly, anxious to get to the next thing, sort of speed things along. I'm finding the dialogue is slowing me down, and I'm even not really reading the text ahead of the dialogue. So I'm actually listening to full passages. And weirdly, I think the performances are good. They're not amazing. Like, some of them are really good. Quite a few of them are not that great to me. But I am listening to all of them, and I'm getting more of the story, and I'm actually getting more of a sense of the detail that the game is continually throwing at you, and that's actually been quite transformational. Like I feel I know the game better this time round, and I'm following it in more detail. And that's been great. So at the very, even if some of the performances aren't amazing, the fact that they're pinning me to take the story in more detail, that's been great. I really, really like the performance of the main reader, which I think he's recorded 300,000 or 400,000 lines, which is just inconceivable. So it's an actor called Lenville Brown, and he plays almost all of the emotions and internal monologues, almost all of that, and narration. So any description of what's around you, which isn't obviously voiced or expressed or represented by another character he's doing, and all of the emotions, or what are they called? Personas, whatever they are. And he doesn't do different voices for any of it. I thought it was really surprising as well. Like in that first section where you're waking up right at the start of the game, he's reading out different personas, all with the same basic voice and same basic inflection. And I was surprised, like, oh, these don't sound distinct from each other. And it's the style that he's used is very methodical, I'd say. Every syllable is pronounced. It's reasonably slow. It's measured, and he goes through it. And it's very well read. But they're all the same like that.
Your lizard brain has a very distinctive voice, doesn't it?
Yeah. So they kept that
voice.
one.
It's very different.
Yeah, that was established by the original intro, which was at the very start was voiced, and that's still there. So there's a lizard one. I think that's all voiced by Mikey W. Goodman.
Who's the lead singer of a band called Sixth.
Yeah. And Lenville Brown is the lead singer of a ska band called Maroon Town, who've been going around. I listened to a bunch of their stuff. They've been going since the 80s, like this sort of amazing kind of ska band, sort of London going. But yeah, so he sort of fills in after the intro ends, that you're aware of from playing it the first time round. And I think somehow it really works for me. There's something calm about the way he voices it, something very, that methodical sort of rhythm that he has as well. It's so good. But there is emotion there as well. And, whether it's sort of despairing or kind of violent, or it is there, but it's really downplayed, not underplayed, because I think it's just right. But
it's a bit of a shame, because I would love to hear like what perception sounds like and what stealth sounds like, and some of these like more technical ones of just like, okay, do that, like what's that voice?
I think what he does is allow you to read it in your own way still, because he's not dictating it, which is probably a real strength, and it gives a consistency as well. I mean, don't forget I'm trying to think, is it 20 different personas or something? If you've got 20 different voices on top of all of the characters, that might be over far too much to deal with as a player anyway. For me, it definitely works. And there are, your limbic system and your reptilian brain, they're still madly voiced by Mikey Goodman. I would want to pull out a couple of other readers as well. I really like Joyce Messier's voice, which is by Tegan Hitchens. That's a really kind of just a posh older woman. Really good. Really, that's a good one. Measurehead, who's voiced by someone called Dizzy Dross. That's really good. Cuno was voiced in the original, wasn't
Yes.
Very notably. It was a rough as hell performance, but really kind of fitted the character. And I saw a lot of people in our Discord were very not happy with the new Cuno. They found him much of a performance, I think, too sort of refined versus the very raw original.
Yeah, it's Kuno's working for me, and Kuno S is working for me as well. But they're definitely, I did vaguely remember that. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Really, it's just been really nice just to go through it with such and actually slow down and kind of listen to it all. I was worried actually because time in the game progresses as you're going through the dialogue, and that's like evidently a choice on developers. And it means that I'm spending a lot more time in game time, kind of just chatting to people. It seems to be working all right. I'm kind of doing things that I should be on day 3, so it's all right. But I don't know. It must.
What
have
kind
been
of character
some
are you going for this time?
Empathetic, being just very sort of sensitive, empathetic, and sort of quick to apologize. So I got sorry cop very quickly.
What have you been playing, Tom?
I've been playing a couple of things. One of which is Boomerang X, which is, I was really hoping this would happen in the IGF, that something really great would come out of nowhere. And this doesn't exactly come out of total obscurity. It's being published by Devolver, so it's possible. Some of you have heard of it, but I had never heard of it, and it's immediately brilliant. It's a first-person action game in the vein of Devil Daggers, I would say. That's one of the closest points of comparison, in that it's about arenas and enemies that are going to teleport in, and it's just all about with how much finesse you can take them out. But it's less pure than Devil Daggers in the sense that it's not just one arena that's like a flat space. It's you are traveling through a world, and every now and then you stop and it becomes an arena and you fight people off. But you have a boomerang, as you might imagine, and that's kind of the core of all of the mechanics that stem from there, and it becomes a mobility tool, because one of the first things you learn to do is after you've thrown your boomerang, there's a button you can press to basically teleport to it, and not only do you arrive at its location, but you also inherit its velocity. So however fast it's traveling, now you're traveling that fast in that direction. So going from 0 to 60 is just instant and incredibly easy. And then you're sailing through the air. So the whole thing is like aerial acrobatics. And while you're in the air, you can then aim another boomerang throw. And I will say it takes a bit of configuration to get the controls set up the way that makes sense to me, at least. But there is basically a slow-mo button, which you can only use while you're charging a throw. And so it makes sense to me that it should just always be in slow-mo when you're charging a throw. And there's an option for that. You can turn that on. So basically, once you have that set up, now as you're arcing through the air, you aim a new boomerang throw, you sort of hold it down to charge the throw. And while you're doing that, you're going in super slow motion. So now you can do things like vault over somebody and in slow motion, aim a precision throw at their back to hit like a weak spot that's only on their back. And there's a specific kind of enemy that's the only way to destroy them. And that just feels fucking great. And I don't think I've ever played something where I've gone from, fumbling with the controls and trying to figure out what the hell this game is to sailing through the air doing incredible slow motion kills in such a short space of time. You learn it like so fast, and the level of finesse and the spectacular things you're doing that early on is just so cool. And yeah, all the enemies are kind of designed to push you to engage with this movement mechanic. So like I say, there's a big kind of enemy that, like a big sort of stone golem kind of thing that has a weak spot only on its back, and that you can only harm it by hitting it there. You only have to hit it once, so one good shot takes it out, which is really satisfying. And all the time you're not taking it out, it is generating other enemies. It's creating these little like flying squid things that are just going to very slowly kind of track you, and individually they're no problem, but if you don't pay attention, you can get overwhelmed. And then your boomerang goes through anything it kills. And there's a lot of basic enemies that just take one hit. You don't need to worry about weak spots. You can just kill them with any throw, but there's a lot of them, and it's really because you're being so acrobatic that these guys are a problem, because if you're just on the ground and walking around, it's very easy to keep track of where they all are, and if you just keep moving, you're faster than them, so they'll always be, in the same direction. But once you're launching yourself into the air to get this like slow motion back shot on this other guy, when you land, you're suddenly like, shit, where am I? Where are all the spiders? Where are all the squids? Where is this? How did I leave this arena? And what state is it? And which directions do I need to worry about? It does a nice thing where if something's creeping up behind you, you get a kind of black shadow in your vision, on the edge of your vision, telling you which direction to turn to see what's about to hit you. Because if something does hit you, initially it's an instant kill. Then slowly over the course of the game, you get like 1 extra hit point or 2 extra hit points. But yeah, you're never going to have 100 health. It's very small numbers. And it's got a bunch of other cool finesse things, like if you kill 2 things with the boomerang with the same throw, like kill something on the way out, on the way back, or just line them up so you get a lot of kills with 1 throw, that charges up a kind of shotgun ability where now you can just hit this button to blast a huge kind of shower of shrapnel that's going to shred everything in front of you, which obviously also reminds me of Devil Daggers. And later on, I'm not that far into it, but I've had an arena where, in addition to those stone guys with the weak spot on the back, there's a massive frog with a weak spot on the top of it and on the bottom of it. So to get the top one, you obviously need to launch yourself in the air, and from directly above it, throw a boomerang down. Your boomerang is your only weapon. That's the only way you can deal damage, except for that shotgun thing, I guess. And so you have to use your boomerang to both launch yourself into the air, then get it back and throw it down while you're still in midair. Then you need to land back on the ground and wait for it to jump so that you can get underneath it and throw a boomerang up into its belly to get its other weak spot and take it out that way. Then there's like a massive fucking giraffe, like a giraffe that sort of like takes up. It's the closest point of comparison is the tall striders from Horizon Zero Dawn. You know, those ones you have to climb to fill out the map, like the absolutely vast things that its weak spots are sort of on the joints of its legs, like at the very top. And I think there's one on its head as well. But all of the time that it's out there, it can cast this weird like storm cloud thing that descends from the sky and is basically a danger zone. Like if you, at that point, it's like a height limit. If you go that high and you hit that danger zone, you're going to lose health. And so it puts a kind of dampener on your acrobatic abilities. Like, yes, do the acrobatic cool shit, but wait for your moment. Don't do it all the time. You need to think about when to strike. And yeah, all the enemies feel really like designed from the ground up for this movement mechanic and to push you to do amazing things and to think about how you're playing. And yeah, it's just so satisfying. I never really clicked with Devil Daggers because it was too stripped down for me. I think as far as I know, you can't win, right? You're just trying to survive for as long as possible. And
it's time attack, basically, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a series of arenas, and you win them. You're given a goal, and you complete it, and the enemy stops spawning at that point, and then you move on, you explore a bit more, and you get a new ability, and it's got that. That's a loop that really works for me. And actually, just because I was trying to find out how much of this game is public to make sure I was okay to talk about it, I looked at their website and realized there's actually a load of abilities I don't have yet, which is cool. And by the way, it is public. There's a demo on Steam that you can get. I don't know how much of the game it is, but I imagine it will get you to the cool acrobatic stuff I'm talking about. Yeah, it's a lot more of a game than in the traditional sense than Devil Daggers is. Whereas Devil Daggers feels almost like a sport where it's just like get good at this one thing and that's the entire game. And for me, that wasn't a great fit. I like to progress and I like to feel like I've achieved something and I like to unlock new abilities. And also I want to be doing incredible shit. Like I don't want my performance just to only be good if I'm incredibly skillful. I would like to look amazing even if I'm not that great at it.
So it's kind of a lot more expressive than Devil Daggers.
Yeah. And just more just like big scale, huge leaps, huge arenas, lots of verticality. It's kind of the most vertical action game that I've played, and usually that's a buzzword that gets real tiresome because just making a level really tall doesn't really help anybody, and it just makes it annoying to have to keep looking up and down. But in this, because you have such an easy way of gaining massive velocity and arcing through these spaces, that actually works a treat.
That sounds really rad.
Was it you, Chris, that was playing it? There was a demo in one of the recent Steam demo kind of festivals. There was a game.
Oh.
Do you know what I mean?
Thingy Night. Tom will know what this is because it's
Shady Night.
Shady Night, that's the one. Thingy Night, you know. Thingy Night.
Yeah, that was fun. I played that also. Yeah, it's like that, but Shady Night was very like smaller scale action and less sort of huge leaping around. And I felt it was more demanding in terms of precision and having to hit all the right buttons at the right times to do the cool thing. And Boomerang X, I think, does a good job of without too much complication, getting you to do really spectacular things without having to learn a lot of different buttons. There was a weird thing in Shady Night, wasn't there, where like grabbing weapons and vaulting towards weapons were like the same thing, and so you sometimes kind of needed to need a weapon just to kind of get yourself across the arena.
I don't know if you needed one just to traverse, but grabbing a weapon could be a form of traversal. Like a weapon in the air is something you could teleport to.
I played the Shady Night demo as well, and it felt very stop-start to me. Like, I felt like either I would die in the little scenario and be at the checkpoint and doing it again and again, or I would do it well, but I would feel like I'd done it in a really clumsy way, and so I would want to restart in order to try and do it as smoothly as it seemed possible, which sort of, in both instances, just frustrated me. Like, even when I was restarting of my own accord, I didn't necessarily enjoy that. It sounds like Boomerang X is more expansive in a way that you can get into a flow state with it more easily.
Yeah. I will say there is the one moment of frustration in Boomerang X is each arena is many waves, sometimes like 8 waves or something. And if you clear 7 waves and then you die on the 8th, you've got to start the entire thing from the start. You don't get to save between waves. And that is, it's a big fuck you from me when that happens. It's I quit basically every time that does happen. I was very annoyed about that at first, and then what I sort of found myself saying to myself was, well, if you're going to do that, then I'm going to stop playing every time that happens. And I thought, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I should stop playing when that happens. What have you been playing, Graham?
I've been playing the exact opposite game. It sounds like I've been playing
Transport Tycoon?
Paradise Lost.
Cool.
Which is like a first-person narrative game about an alternate history in which World War II didn't end in the 1940s. It continued into the 1960s until the Nazis had developed nuclear weapons, much like the John Milton epic poem.
Wolfenstein.
Paradise Lost.
Oh.
Yeah. And so, it's set inside a Nazi bunker, basically, and quite early on, it's a game about walking around empty spaces, picking up notes and piecing together a narrative that happened long before you arrived. Quite early on, it spells out the past quite directly, as you basically find like a letter that someone has typed up with what the Nazi plan is, and it's got like 6 points on there, where it's like, point number 1, launch nuclear weapons at everywhere. Point number 2, use superior members of society in secret bunker and get them to start a breeding program. Step 2, train the children to be superior super soldiers. Step 4, re-emerge on the surface and use the super soldiers to defeat our enemies. And I feel like if you've got point 1 on your plan is launch nuclear weapons in all directions, but that doesn't win you the war. The way you're going to win the war is through a breeding program through which you're going to develop super soldiers, and they're going to be what wins you the war. What? But I also just love the idea that someone's written this down as like just a numbered list.
It's the wiki. It's like the WikiHow.
Don't forget. Note to self.
And you're descending. You're a child, so let's start there. There's lots of layers to this. So you're a 12-year-old. You're a 12-year-old child. The bunker is somewhere in Poland, and Poland has been destroyed by nuclear war, but it's been long enough that the surface is traversable, if not yet inhabitable. And you find this bunker, and you're descending into it, and you're discovering A, why it was built, B, what happened to the Nazis who were there, and then what happened to the people who found it after the Nazis, and then what they did and what happened to them. And and there is one person that you're talking to over a radio, and everything else is either very short flashback cutscenes involving your character's mother, or it's notes and audio tapes and that sort of stuff, audio diaries. So it's one of those, and it's a game in which you walk very slowly. There's no run button, there's no jump button, there's nothing like that. There's not even any environment puzzles. You walk through these spaces, and the spaces are the thing that it's got going for it. So like this is an underground bunker, but it's absolutely enormous. It's huge cavernous spaces in which they've put like man-made lakes and an artificial lighting so that they can grow crops and build absurd Nazi architecture and edifices to their greatness, I suppose. And so like you're exploring these kind of very decadent buildings and housing facilities, but it's all underground in these enormous caves, and there's big statues, and it has this sort of Bioshocky feel throughout the whole thing. And like I enjoyed exploring those spaces. I less enjoyed any of the narrative elements of it. Like I say, there's the kind of layers of like you're finding out about the Nazi history, you're finding out about the Polish people that followed on from them, and that's audio diaries which you can't pick up. You just hit play, and then you have to stand next to them in the room in order to listen to them. Or sometimes it's these sort of computer tubes that you I can't remember what the game calls them, but they're
a series of tubes,
tube-shaped objects that you pick up, cylinders that you then slot into a computer, and you'll get again an audio recording, but also these sort of like top-down computer maps of different scenes that are playing out, and these are quite effective actually. Like there is something about scenes of violence and fighting played out via little dots on a computer screen, with just little snippets of audio on top that feels very cold and detached in a way that I found quite affecting. Unfortunately, the writing's not great and the dialogue is inconsistent, and it just gets increasingly absurd, essentially, in that it descends quite quickly into science fiction. I mean, more science fiction than just alternate history World War II. And the Nazis apparently invented an AI computer that you could insert into people's brains in order to make them smarter and unlock the power of the brain, and then like are specifically breeding people possibly for this purpose and plugging them into computers and stuff like that. It's not really a spoiler. These are things you find out very early in the game. But I'm beginning to feel as if I'm just over this in general as a storytelling technique. Like the listening to tapes and the reading to notes genre of game. Like we talked about this, Marsh and I, last week, where I'm completely okay with games that have no puzzles or no action or no like overt gameplay mechanics, and games which are just linear stories. I'm okay with that as well. But it's extremely difficult, I think, to tell a meaningful story that happened long before you arrived, where you're finding out everything in retrospect. It's difficult to connect to characters that from the off are dead, and you can have no real-time conversations with them. You're just listening to them on audio tapes. And what it does for me is that it tends to make these stories more about underlying ideas and themes, maybe, rather than about the actual tension or drama or character drama of the narrative that you're being told. And that's a problem here when the underlying ideas and themes I feel like are quite stupid or unconsidered, maybe. Like it feels like maybe this is a game constructed based on a series of what if statements. Like, like, wouldn't it be interesting if the Nazis didn't lose the war and it continued into the 60s? Wouldn't it be interesting if you stumbled across a bunker and descended into it and it was this massive complex that you could explore? Wouldn't it be interesting if there was these like sci-fi devices that you were then discovering as you moved through it, that sort of stuff? But when you piece it together and try and work out, well, what is this actually saying? What is this communicating about the Nazis, or about the Polish people that came afterwards, or about the kind of, there's like themes of paranoia and superstition and all this sort of stuff, but none of it really hangs together into like a coherent, hey, this is what this game is about, or hey, this is what this game is saying about those themes. And without going into spoilers, it's difficult to talk about, but that's quite a bad problem to have when the Nazis are central to your, like, if you're going to explore some of those ideas, there's certain things that you want to state maybe more clearly than this game does. Yeah, I'm being very ambiguous there because I don't want to spoil it for people, even though I wouldn't recommend necessarily that you go play this.
How did you feel about the Outer Wilds in terms of like learning about characters who lived a long time ago and coming to care about them?
So I haven't played the Outer Wilds past the first like 20 minutes or so. So I like it when it's done well. And
technically, there's only 20 minutes, so
that's true. The Outer Wilds, like it, I've listened to you guys talk about it in previous episodes of the podcast and stuff like that, and it seems like there is a central mystery, and that the planets that you're visiting each have a really strong and interesting sci-fi concept that makes them visually interesting and distinct, and then also you're trying to work out, well, why is it this way? Why does it work this way? That sounds like really compelling stuff from a kind of, the narrative is a puzzle. So I haven't played enough of it to know what it's like in terms of character drama. But yeah, it sounds like it's got other things going for it.
Yeah,
I don't disagree that, like, I think it can be a tough thing to have certain kinds of character drama in this format. I would also point to Edith Finch as a game that I think pulls that off. I mean, the obvious one is Gone Home, but as the kind of originator of this way of telling a story. And then Firewatch sits somewhere in the middle of this pattern, I guess. But did you play Edith Finch, Graham? I'd be interested to see how you felt about that relative to this way of telling a story.
So I did play Edith Finch, and I loved Edith Finch. I think that's great. Like, I think Edith Finch does
you actually play as those characters, basically, don't you?
Yeah.
It's not just hearing about them. You go back and be them.
That's true.
Yeah, that's the thing. And like Edith Finch, each vignette is like what you're doing is shaped around the narrative. So it's the mechanics are a metaphor for the story that it's telling you. It's so like it goes so much further than any of these games in bringing that story to life and making those characters feel real and alive until they're not. Whereas these other games where the characters are just, they're literally all dead pretty much in Paradise Lost, and you're just reading their fucking typed letters and listening to their recorded conversations. I find that much more difficult to get invested in. Gone Home worked for me, and I think partly that's because there was a central mystery element of like, well, these people are alive. I just don't know where they are, or at least I think they're alive. And then there was also like something compelling about the fact that it wasn't 100% clear what genre the game was. Like the possibility space felt larger than it actually was, and there was a tension in that you weren't sure exactly what genre of story you were reading, essentially, so you didn't know where it was going to go. Whereas in Paradise Lost, there is a kind of twist to it, but I worked out that twist very early on because it's incredibly obvious, like so obvious that it might not be a twist. Like, it's a thing that the character you're playing as doesn't know, or but maybe they wanted the player to know much earlier than the character, the protagonist. I don't know. I'm not sure. But either way, like it didn't hang together in that way.
This might be a question that goes nowhere, but I was noticing recently that a very common format for this kind of story in like TV and books actually is there's one person who is missing or dead right at the start, and their best friend or someone close to them is then investigating that, but investigating a whole bunch of other stuff. And as they go along, they piece together that person's life and learn a lot about them. Like Veronica Mars is this format, Pretty Little Liars is as well. And I was just trying to think if there are any games that have done that, because that seems like it would fit games pretty well, where you're not asking people to care about a whole cast of characters who are long gone, but just pick one person who is close to your character. And Twin Peaks, of course, is another huge one where, it's not solving the murder is part of it, but also in the course of that, you discover all this stuff you didn't know about this character. This character had a whole secret life going on.
There's The Suicide of Rachel Foster, which came out, I'm going to say last year. It could have been 2 years ago, but I think it was last year. And that has, like, you're investigating a person's death, and you're learning about them and maybe a couple of other characters in the process, and trying to piece together what happened in this old building. But that game had other problems, many of which are summarized by its title. Yeah. I think like Firewatch did this well, and I'm always surprised. I mean, games are hard to make, aren't they? So maybe I'm not surprised, actually. But Firewatch felt like a fairly natural next step for the Gone Home formula in the way it handled its conversations. And, I mean, it's another cliche that I'm slightly tired of, that there is a woman on the end of a radio that you're talking to. And Paradise Lost does have a woman on the end of a radio, and you do make some dialogue choices throughout it, but it just can't get past the fact that its writing and its voice acting is not very good. But it also doesn't have nearly the flexibility that Firewatch felt as if it had in your choices, your dialogue choices, your ability to ignore certain lines, your ability to interrupt, that sort of stuff. Like, there are ways in which you can do a really linear narrative with a very narrow level of interactivity and tell a story in retrospect, but still allow some player expression. And I think sometimes, like, that's what I need more of, even if it's just like I said last week, take a long drag of your cigarette button or something to help invest me in this space. That would make a big difference. And then maybe beyond that, maybe it's just you need a really good writer. Like, if you're going to build your game entirely on narrative.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe part of this is that there aren't that many writers who can pull off a story that is told just through a very narrow scope like that. And then the overlap of that and people who can get the funding for good voice acting is probably even narrower.
Yeah, probably. And I haven't actually looked this up, but I would strongly suspect that this is made by an Eastern European company, and it's set in Poland, and so that's fine. But all the voice acting is in English, or at least, maybe you can change the language, but I played it in English, and so there is a challenge there. Of course, if you're a small indie studio with a small budget relying on local voice actors, maybe, because that's what you can afford and that's what's around, but you need them to speak in a second language. That's tough. What have you been playing, Chris?
So I have been playing, I'll get to the game specifically in a minute, but I just realized that the game I've been playing is the opposite of Paradise Lost and is therefore quite similar to the game Tom was playing. Which was so
Boomerang
back the other way.
X.
But yeah, so I've had an interesting couple of weeks, I guess, since I was last on the podcast, game-wise, because my new PC finally arrived. I know we don't talk about hardware very much, but I have had that experience of having quite a significant upgrade after 5 years on the same machine. A machine that I felt was doing fine, I think particularly as there aren't necessarily a huge number of games around that really require or make best advantage of very powerful PCs now. But after 3 or 4 months of waiting for my graphics card to noodle its way free of a pile of crypto bot people or whatever, I have a new PC, which has allowed me to jump back into a whole bunch of things at the highest kind of fidelity, and that's been a really interesting experience. It's been interesting to go back to VR, and so there's a whole bunch of things that I feel like I don't have quite a full takes on yet, but going back to VR, going back to Half-Life Alyx, going back to Star Wars Squadrons in quite a big way, and the main one that's taken up quite a lot of my time over the last couple of weeks is going back to Cyberpunk, which has had its first big patch. Imagine, put your scare quotes wherever you like. It's your podcast. Do what you want. Recently, but also explicitly playing it on a computer that I can turn everything up to 100%, the ultra blah blah blah, and super sample everything, and it doesn't break a sweat, which reveals an actual video game underneath all of the jank that everyone experienced, including me trying to play it on anything else. I thought maybe I'd be ready to talk about Cyberpunk this episode, but I don't think I am yet, because it's a big game and I want to, I think, probably finish it before I return to it. But it's been an interesting experience to play that game in an environment where technical issues aren't a factor, aside from the ones that can't be fixed by technology, basically. But a game I have been playing that I like to talk about is also a Cyberpunk game. Is also quite pretty, and also involves katanas. So there's the segue, which is Ghostrunner, which is a little like, was it Boomerang X, you said, Tom? Similar in that it is a kind of pared back, movement focused first person action game. Say an action game because it's not a shooter, where you are a Ghost Runner, which is a robot ninja, basically a Genji from Overwatch, but in a much more Unreal Engine-y sort of way, whom sort of chop people up in a very, very massive, detailed sort of cyberpunk styled jungle gyms, effectively. So I would describe it as living somewhere on the spectrum between Titanfall, movement-wise, in terms of running, jumping, wall running, and other mechanics which I'll get into. But also the game that it reminds me the most of is N+, which might be a weird comparison, given that N+ is a platform game, a side-on platform game, and this is a first-person game, and a very kind of hyper-detailed one, not a stick-person game. But it has a similar set of mechanics in terms of, wall jumping, but also in the way that encounters are constructed, which I'll talk about in a moment, and also in its kind of lethality. So this is a game where one hit from anything kills you instantly, and one swipe from your katana kills pretty much any enemy instantly. And this is impressive given the the fidelity of the engine, where it is sort of instant restart, and therefore it has that fast iteration cycle of an action game, which also puts it in the same territory, something like Hotline Miami, where you sort of test and reattempt and eventually perfect a kind of series of moves that will unpick a combat challenge that will be based around the kind of enemies you're facing, where you're facing them, and a bunch of other mechanics. So you have grapple points and walls that are there for wall running. You have a whole sort of suite of abilities that interact with these things. So in addition to the running, jumping, and wall running, and the grapple, you have a dash move, which also has a really interesting alternative use that I've never seen before, where if you hold the dash button, which is normally shift, you get some bullet time. And while you're in bullet time, you can use the left and right keys, A and D, to not move left and right, but literally teleport, change your position about 5 feet either side of where you are. It's not a strafe because you don't move linearly. It's a sideways teleport that can only be used while you're dashing and when you're in bullet time. And that sounds weird, but it's basically this way of flinging all your momentum towards someone, waiting till the moment where they're about to shoot you, then going into bullet time and just repositioning yourself slightly to the side of where you were so that the rest of your descent or your leap or whatever takes place just slightly off center from what you initially input in order to evade the bullet and deal a killing blow or whatever. And it feels really good. You also get like a teleport strike ability, which you can do through enemies if you line them up. And then there are, for example, pickups you can find in the levels that will give you sort of full slow-mo for a period of time where you're moving extremely quickly relative to the action on the map. And then there are sort of mechanics which do really remind me of N+, which, like, you'll have enemies that you can't hurt because they're protected by a force field, but those force fields are all visibly linked to a big disco ball, cyberpunk disco ball thing that will be somewhere on the level, inevitably, usually up in a tangle of wall running points and other kind of platform challenges. And so you must always be moving because you can get shot very easily, and some enemies have automatic weapons, and so you're always moving, but you're also planning routes that will take you up and through this thing you need to smash to make the enemies below you vulnerable, so then you can then plan the rest of your route through those enemies to complete the little zone or the level. And it's a really good little set of mechanics. And I was thinking about it today when I was playing it, because I think it has, even though it's a very, very twitchy game, the mechanics are sort of the rules, in addition to obviously all of the kind of very analog finesse you can try and pull out of any first-person action game. Those rules about who you can fight and when and how you progress through the environment are pretty robust in a way that reminds me more of, like, almost in some ways like puzzle tactics games or whatever. And I was thinking, like, these exact sets of logic could be applied to a grid-based strategy game, in a sense, in terms of how do I use my action points most effectively to get through all these enemies without being hit by any of the telegraphed attacks or bullets, which actually reminded me of the kinds of games you like, Tom. So I thought you might actually like it for that reason, apart from the fact that your way of engaging with it is so much more kind of twitchy and kinetic. And so the campaign, it has a story campaign that I'm maybe a third of the way through now after a couple of hours, which is I'm really enjoying it. It's really fun. It looks great. And it is, I'm going to be super nice. It is refreshingly old school in its interpretation of what I'm doing a cyberpunk means. In that you play a man who may as well be called Jack Ghostrunner, a cool cyberpunk samurai who fell very far down a big mega city and now must fight his way back up with the help of his two best friends, an AI architect who may have built the city originally, who speaks in a very deep voice into one ear, and the plucky leader of a band of resistance rebels who just wants you to do the right thing and help the downtrodden denizens of the underhive, basically. And it's so incredibly uninterested in being more complicated than that, I think. It's very, 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 very much feels like an action game from about 15 years ago, in a way that I found quite comforting, I think, because it reminded me of, like, being shown a game at Gamescom, in the way that it just feels like a video game, like a picture of a video game drawn by anybody. And that's somehow satisfying. It has, when the moment when you're revealed to be called Jack is very funny, because there's no reason that you should be this. You're a robot. And then the character explains that they call you Jack because they found you at the bottom of a trash pile, and you were really jacked up when they found you.
Oh my God.
And it's like, it's a good job. It's like, if you'd found me on a toilet, would I be called John? Like, I
and that's why we call you Shit Heap.
Exactly. When we found you, both of your robot legs had been severed, and that's why you're called Alegs. And like, I love this because they really just wanted you to be good because, after the opening of the section of the game, you get some update to your firmware that lets you speak again. I was like, oh, what am I going to sound like? And you immediately sound like this. You just sound like a cool video game man. And in a way, it's determination to reassert that while you are a robot cyborg with no feelings, you are also just video game man from video game land. I thought it was quite heroic in its own way.
I like the idea. I might have misinterpreted, but when you said that your sort of the inciting incident is you just fell a really long way down the cyberpunk city, I love that as a very prosaic setup for a game. Like, oh, I'm just really far down now, and I'd rather be higher up, please.
Unfortunately, it's much more lore-based than that. You had,
that's all you need.
You got beaten up by Dr. Octopus, and you fell very far, and then like 300 years passed or something, and then someone found you in a bin. Like, there's a big time jump, but it doesn't matter, because what matters is you go very fast and jump and slide and grapple and slice people's heads off. Yeah, I like it. I picked it up. It was just on a Steam sale, which is helpfully now ended, and I think it is I think it's in the sort of £20 to £30 range normally, and I think unless you really love this type of game, that might be a bit rich. But I got it on sale, and I am quite enjoying it.
Is the IP worth £5 million or €5 million, which is that's what it sold for recently?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. 505 bought it for £5 million. €5 million.
Wow.
How would you expand the universe, Chris?
Well, so this is
going
the thing.
downwards.
I find that a little interesting because, so, 505 are a mid-sized publisher with some resources, and I can understand them wanting to maybe put a flag in the map and build some sort of, franchises for themselves. But this is a great looking game. And obviously Cyberpunk is very popular at the moment. Maybe when that deal was underway, that was a fairly safe bet based on things this game would sit next to. But all right, I'm going to put it this way. In a way, I don't know why I'm being so nice, but like, I am glad it is not more narratively ambitious, because it feels like, and I say this, it feels like the kind of like modest but technically impressive like output of a mid-sized studio. It achieves all the things it sets out to achieve, but it's not setting out to be everything to everybody by any means. And the narrative side of it is exactly the sort of thing, because it's heavily like voice in your ear type narrative, which I will say is well implemented with the fact that you restart all the time. It's good at playing you the lore once and then not again, for example, if you replay a section. It's the kind of voice in your ear narrative delivery where you can just sort of like butter a writer on top of it at any point in development, right? Like, no one, it's typically the sort of thing where a writer would be brought in to kind of explain why you're jumping up some pipes, but the pipes were definitely already there. The stages were definitely built by the time it became time to apply a story. And the story they've applied over the top is like capital F fine. It's not very ambitious, apart from in its intent to give you because it really wants you to be called Jack, but it also really doesn't want to have to explain why that's the case, and then it does anyway. That's the most ambitious thing in the story. Everything else is very rote, very rote cyberpunk / dystopian sci-fi. If they brought in a writer, they could have maybe layered something of greater meaning on top of that, but I think it would have inevitably become some sort of like discursive philosophical experience, and I'm quite glad it isn't. But that is the nicest thing I can say about it, I think, in terms of its narrative ambition. So I'm not really sure where the IP comes from necessarily, other than maybe its proximity to cyberpunk. However, I will say one thing that's nice about it that also plays against that is it is targeting such a specific audience. It's really hard from the beginning, and they just added a challenge map mode where it's basically like time trials, getting through a tough level in certain while collecting power-ups and getting time extends for killing enemies and things. And the first one is so hard I couldn't do it. I had to watch someone do it on YouTube, even though it's like a 20-second run, just to kind of have a sense of how I might do it. And that's not the kind of game people tend to make very much, and I kind of like it for that. I kind of like that it's so committed to just being set of mechanics that you bash your head against until you kind of crack them, and then you slip and slide around like a cool ninja. But I don't know if that's necessarily like going to be the next big thing, because it's definitely not in a hurry to make you feel like you're good at it, because otherwise it wouldn't need an instant restart button.
Right. It did. I think this game sold well, right? I think it says here it recouped its 2.5 million euro production costs on launch day and sold more than 500,000 copies by the end of 2020. It's just the thing that made me kind of laugh about the story is just that they bought the IP, which didn't seem like the part that's important to me.
Yeah, I mean, like, I find that surprising. I do. But
yep, I agree.
I mean,
really, when you think about it.
I mean, like, I'm literally trying to think of an explanation for this other than it does look a bit like cyberpunk, because it is a cyberpunk genre thing, right? That might be worth a lot. Is it based on anything? I don't know.
We just don't know.
We just don't know. I'm not going to do a great job of discourse here necessarily. It's quite a good game. I'm enjoying it so far. I would buy it for the good movement and combat mechanics, not for the story. And I probably wouldn't buy the IP personally, but good for you if you did.
Well done, 505.
There's quite a lot of studios involved, including 3D Realms. I don't know exactly what 3D Realms did, but cool. Sorry, I mean, I don't know if it's a game where you run and jump and you hit people. We've probably covered these in the past, but it's okay by me. Tom, did you have another game you wanted to talk about?
Yes, I do. Trials of Fire, the most forgettable name, unfortunately. It doesn't really tell you anything, but the game is a roguelike deck builder, which has got me on board already, and mixes that with hex grid-based combat, and you have a party of people rather than just one character. And I feel like I've played takes on that before, especially like this idea that you can have a sort of grid-based battler, but you're dealt cards, and the cards determine whether you can move. Fights in Tight Spaces also is a play on that. And I haven't played the final version or the released version of Fights in Tight Spaces, but one issue I remember having with the version I did play was that if you don't get dealt a movement card, you can't move, and that's very much limits your options. And Trials of Fire gets around that with its system is that you can, instead of being given like 3 energy per turn and then spending that on your cards that cost different amounts the way you do in Slay the Spire, the energy is, you start with 0 energy and you can only gain it by throwing cards away. So when you discard a card, you get 1 energy for doing that. And the energy is shared between all 3 of your characters. So it becomes a question of, like, my warrior has just moved into the thick of things. They really need to play all their cards. I don't want to sacrifice any of their cards. So my rogue, who's hanging back and can take pot shots, instead of taking a pot shot, actually they're going to have to sacrifice their cards to get us some energy, so that I can then spend that on my warrior's card so that my warrior can do more this turn. So you can kind of transfer your actions between your characters that way. And it also has a fallback where, as if you sacrifice a card for energy, instead of spending that energy, you can also just move them 2 paces. So you can always move. You're never, if you really need to move, you can just do it, because you'll always have cards in your hand and you can always spend them to move. In fact, you can move a long way if you wanted to. I think you get dealt 3 cards per turn, maybe 4 in some situations. And so each one of those lets you move 2 spaces if you sacrifice it. So potentially you could move the entire length of the map with one character in one turn, if you're willing to sacrifice all your cards to do it. But that part has to be that character's cards. And the game is full of little like rules like that kind of, at first it seems very liberal and very, everything can be everything and it's all a wash. But then you realize, actually, no, I can't. This character who has these 3 this warrior who's in the thick of things, they've got 3 great abilities. I want them to use them all, but I also need them to get out of that situation by the end of the turn. And to get out of the situation, they have to spend one of their cards. No one else can do it for them. And so it does produce tough situations like that. And the main thing that works about it for me, basically like roguelike deck builders, obviously a trendy genre ever since Slay the Spire. And I think there haven't been that many of them that have really clicked and taken off. I think designing a deck like that just takes a lot of skill. There's just a whole art form to it that I don't understand. And the Slay the Spire folks really do on a level that I don't think anybody else does. I think even Monster Train, which I really love, I don't think maybe they're not going for it, but they haven't nailed what Slay the Spire does with its decks, where you just sort of years later you're still discovering new ways to combine them, and everything feels like it's there for a reason. You sort of, once you do that well enough, you cross some invisible threshold where the player just sort of trusts that you know what you're doing with the cards, and that when there's a card they don't see the value of, there probably is a reason for that card to exist, and I should try and find a way to use it. I wouldn't say Trials of Fire quite hits that height, but it definitely, for me, it immediately sort of marked itself out as one of the good ones. Like, it's one that gets deck building, where with all 3 of my characters, I have something I'm aiming towards that is really exciting. With the Rogue, I guess actually they're called a Hunter. They have some cards that, like, there's one that's just costs 2 energy and it's a 5 damage range attack. And that's pretty expensive, but it's a good amount of damage. Their perk, though, is that every character has a different perk, and their perk is that the first range attack they do every turn does maybe 2 extra damage. And so your big expensive 5 damage 2 energy card, it's not that big a deal on that. It's making it more powerful, but not that much more powerful. But if you have some cheap attacks that you can kind of play every turn, then they'll always get that benefit. So an attack that only does 1 damage normally now does 3. So you've tripled the damage of that card by playing it first. And then there's powers that they can get that will add damage to every attack they do. There's one that just adds 2 damage to every attack they do forever. And as soon as you've got that in play, every low cost, low damage attack becomes really good, because it's just doing a fixed amount of extra damage. So you can just keep dishing that out. And then there's another power that every time you play a card, you do a free ranged attack on a random enemy. And I think it's only 1 damage at base. But of course, if you have the other one in play where you're doing 2 extra damage, every time you do anything, you're doing a free attack on somebody, and that free attack is boosted by 2. And if it's the first attack you're doing, it's boosted by another 2. And you just become this incredible damage engine. And like, that's just your Hunter. You've got 2 other characters that are all going towards their own synergies and their own, logical extremes of crazy builds. And so what I find happens in a run, the runs are very long, unfortunately. That's a downside of it, is it's more than an hour to play a run. I find usually 2 hours. The last time I won, I had 4 hours on the clock on medium difficulty, but I had kind of been AFK for a bit of that, so I would guess it's about 3 hours for a successful run on normal difficulty for me. I do spend a lot of time thinking about everything. And what I find is, by the end of a run like that, is that one of your characters will have lucked into one of those synergies. Will have, you've picked a good direction for them to go in. You've got the cards you need to do it, and they've become this amazing damage engine. If you won, almost certainly one of your characters has done that. Sometimes a second one has done it. I've never had a run where all 3 of them really come into their own. What tends to happen is that at least one of your characters, you know what you're going for, but it never quite comes together, or they just have too big of a deck. And that means that the synergies that are in there, you're just not getting the right cards in the same hand at the same time. And that is a really interesting aspect of it, because you have a basic starting deck, and then every time you level up, you can either upgrade a card in there, or you can replace it with a new card. So removing and adding is kind of the same thing. But then the way your deck gets bigger is when you equip weapons and armor. So every piece of armor or every weapon has its own cards associated with it. And when you equip it, those cards go in your deck. When you unequip it, they go out again. So you can kind of choose whether you want that stuff in your deck or not. And it tends to be that it's kind of interesting, actually, because the rarest items that are the most powerful add 3 cards to your deck. And that's a lot. And usually at least one of them is not really what you want. You kind of want like one of them, maybe you want 2 of them. It's rare to get all 3 cards actually be really good and good for your build. And so you have this strange, like, conflicting like impulse where you want to equip it because it has some great stuff, but actually it contains some not great cards. And they kind of counteract that by if a piece of gear is really good, if its quality level is high, that gives you more redraws. So when you're dealt the cards you don't want, you can put them back and redraw again. And how many times you can do that is just based on the quality of your gear. So basically, if gear is good quality, it doesn't matter too much if it gives you a bad card because you can redraw that in theory. But then there's also a mechanic about like when you rest, you can, if you have the right resource, you can hone one of your items, which means removing one of the cards that it gives you permanently, so that now that card you don't want isn't in your deck and you just have a really efficient one. And yeah, it's very, I feel like I'm having to learn all over again the thing I learned with Slay the Spire, where early on in Slay the Spire, you just take every card you're offered. You're just like, sure, oh, that sounds good. I want that. That does damage. Sounds like a net win. And as you get better at Slay the Spire, you realize, oh, actually, like, I have to think really carefully about what I add because it dilutes everything else I already have. So if I have good cards, I've got to have a much higher bar for what I add to my deck. And here, the whole logic for all of that is very different in that it's less about individual quality of cards and more about cards that work well together. And you have to, like, you can have a cool item that means it gives you a free move and the move gains you energy rather than costing anything. And it sounds great on paper, but the thing I had with my last run was that my assassin just never came together because the only like scaling mechanic that I had that I was focusing on for them was that they were going to get damage bonuses by going into stealth and by various other synergies with other characters. And then I had a power that would double the damage bonuses. And then I had some attacks that would hit twice, so they'd benefit twice from the damage bonuses, and a special critical strike that would benefit, 6 times from damage bonuses, which all sounds great. But if you don't get the damage bonus in the first place, nothing ever happens. That character just never gets off the ground. Like, it's all, I'm really susceptible to this temptation of like, oh, if I had this online and that online and that online, these powers that you actually have to spend energy to play, then I would be incredibly powerful. So I'll take this stuff, and I underestimate how hard it actually is to get all that stuff. Like, get dealt it, then spend the energy to play it, and then spend the energy to play the other thing and get dealt that as well, and then have it all active at the same time. By the time that's happened, usually the fight is over one way or the other. But yeah, it just has that hold on me that a good roguelike gets, where you get you glimpse the possibilities, you can see, about some brilliant builds that you've done before and you're excited to do again, but you also kind of have the sense like, I bet there's a load of other builds here that I haven't figured out yet. And especially with 3 characters, there's ways to combine these that go beyond the normal deck building thrill. Like, the rogue has this very strange quirk where powers are similar to how they work in Slay the Spire, where that's the thing you cast, and after you cast it, it's a passive effect that remains on you. But weirdly, a character who gets a power in their deck doesn't have to play it on themselves. They can play it on one of your other characters. And for the most part, that doesn't make any sense at all, because things like a warrior getting a power that means they gain energy every time they take a hit, you don't want to cast that on anyone else because your warrior is the one who's going to take the hits. But the ranger has one that is, or hunter, sorry, has one that every time somebody else plays a ranged attack, they gain a damage bonus. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense on a hunter because they're going to be the one doing the ranged attack. So instead, they play that power on somebody else, and then they do the ranged attacks as well to boost their damage. And that, of course, synergizes brilliantly with the assassin thing I was talking about, where like their damage bonuses count double, and they have special attacks that can use them even more. And so there's all these little, I feel like I'm just scratching at the surface of that. That's the first time I've ever cast a power on someone who wasn't the person who owned the power in the first place. And I suspect there's loads more to discover there. So it's just a really exciting, like, playground for mechanics.
Yeah, but the name's still really boring.
It is, yeah. It's like one step away from Game of War, which is the worst title I've ever heard.
Yeah, but that's the thing of it. It's not just boring. It's also that it's sort of suggestive of a lot of kind of trashy mobile games or MMO titles and that sort of stuff, when it's actually much more interesting than that.
Yeah. There's actually I was trying to think, like, it doesn't really relate to anything I've played in the game. Like, I'm not even aware of having gone on a trial. Like, the main quest is about trying to track down a missing elder from your village. And it's not somebody challenging you to a trial or anything. And fire hasn't really come up that much. I mean, there's a burning effect in the game, but it's not sort of central to it. I was thinking about the fiction is like, I don't know, the world it has a flavor to it. It's not completely generic. The races aren't orcs, and there's elves for sure, but I haven't seen an orc. And my assassin is a race that I don't recognize. It's sort of a lizardy, kind of scaly, spiky kind of dude. So it's got a bit of a flavor to it. And I was thinking about like what has worked for me about that side of things, and it definitely isn't the core appeal, but it actually really reminds me of fighting fantasy, like those choose your own adventure books. In a good way, where those also weren't the most original worlds necessarily, but I guess it kind of got into my bones at an early age. Like that is still my archetypal, like, adventurer on a quest in a fantasy land kind of thing that just kind of works for me on a very like instinctual level. And this brings that to mind. The overworld between battles, it is, rather than being Slay the Spire, like map of nodes, or sorry, I should call it the FTL map of nodes, because that was where it got popularized. It's actually much more of an open world, and you are walking around and you're choosing where to stop and choosing whether to stop at various places. You have, if you wanted to, you could keep on stopping at every little ruin and every little village and getting quests and having side encounters that don't relate to your main quest. And that does a lot to make it feel like an adventure. It does boil down to mechanics, and because it's a roguelike deck builder, you're going to focus on the mechanics. But it does have that vibe, and every now and then, moments like that kind of just evoke the excitement of a fantasy adventure. Like there's one encounter where you can sort of choose to take on like a giant worm beast, and the presentation of the battles is very abstracted. It's a arena that is sort of rendered like a 3D environment, but then your people are just tokens, and they just have a picture of the character's portrait is just on a circular token. So it doesn't even try and make it look like a model of the person. It's literally just a game board piece. And the worm is 3 of those, and of course they're connected. And when it moves, when the head one moves, the tail ones have to follow. And it's just kind of a fun gimmick, sort of seeing something that would be very difficult to do as a 3D model, or very difficult to kind of render and make sure it animated correctly and everything. Once you reduce it to this abstracted tokens, it actually becomes easier to do something complicated like that. Because you as the player just accept that it's going to be 3 tokens. It makes sense. And then it leads to all these cool situations where, like, it managed to sort of snake itself around me. And that meant I was technically surrounded. And there are certain mechanics that mean, like, you can't do combo attacks when you're surrounded. And even though there's only one enemy, it's fair enough. That enemy is surrounding me. On all sides, there is enemy. It might not be different thinking entities, but I sure am surrounded. And that's obviously went badly for me. And then on another turn, I had an ability called Crush, which does more damage the more different sides an enemy is boxed in on, which is a really nice idea, because it means, the more cornered you are, the harder this blow hits, which just kind of feels good as a mechanic. And this worm was kind of coiled in on itself, and also I had my guys kind of on either side of it, and I hit it with Crush, and it did like 16 damage, which is the most damage I've ever done with a single melee attack. And it was because it had boxed itself in with its own body. I basically crushed its head into its own body. And it's got that magic where, that is very, on a real level, it's just a very bare bones mechanic. And, I don't even know if the developers even thought about whether the worm's tail counts as, separate enemies or counts as obstacles or whatever. But it's flavorful enough that when you do it, even though what you're looking at is very abstract, you're picturing this scene of crushing a worm's head against its own body.
I really like the kind of booky aesthetic of Ring of Fire. But
Trials of Fire.
Trials of Fire, sorry. But what I was going to say is it's a strong enough aesthetic that whenever I've searched for it over the last couple of years, I've searched for Book of Fire.
I think it's time to do a question.
One question.
One question, because it is getting late and we are tired. No other
Brain's
reason.
tired.
Brain tired. Alex, you are the wielder of the question.
I've got the question.
What is it?
The question is from Tom Pickford. It's a Tom Pickford question. Tom writes, Dear Snakes and Snow Globes, after listening to your discussion about when to put a game down in episode 363, that's 2 episodes ago, it got me thinking about my experience with roguelikes, particularly Invisible Ink and Into the Breach. After a successful run in each of these games, I felt that I'd seen their stories through to a satisfying conclusion. And even though both games are more mechanics-driven than narrative-led, I didn't feel the urge to return to them, despite having unlocked new ways to play. Another mental hurdle with me with Into the Breach was the meta-narrative, where each new run supposedly creates a new timeline and billions of imaginary lives to potential doom. This was apparently too heavy an imaginary burden for me. I enjoyed my time with both games, but never went back to experiment with the new playstyles I'd unlocked. These games are meant to be replayed, but perhaps my response to put them down once I'd seen the end of the story was atypical, and this isn't a problem. However, if this experience is common to other players, could too much narrative be detrimental to the longevity of a roguelike? It's a good question.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that reaction to Into the Breach, because that is not a roguelike I think of as having too much narrative. It's pretty light on it. And I'm such a mechanics-oriented player that it wouldn't have occurred to me to like have second thoughts about starting a new campaign, because you're dooming all these people unless you save them. That framing is obviously, I mean, time, like every roguelike is struggling. Every roguelike that wants to have a story is struggling with the same problem, which is that you're going to go out and see the same stuff, and then you're going to die, and then it'll all be undone, basically. Like, you might have made some overall progress, but we're going to reset you back to the start. And so Into the Breach, its framing for that is, well, you're time travelers, and if you fail, we'll have to restart the timeline, and you'll do it that way. Spelunky, it's a little bit unclear exactly how it works, but the caves supposedly reform themselves, and you are, I don't know, something to do with the magic of the caves means that you start back at the start. Which it's really funny, because that was obviously, I don't know, that held up in original freeware Spelunky, where it was a very lo-fi game. And then in Spelunky 2, when it's your daughter going up there, and she's responding to a letter from her parents saying, hey, we're trapped on the fucking moon, dying endlessly, but it's okay, we're actually having fun. You really start to like scratch your chin about like, what is that like exactly? Do you feel the deaths? You can't escape. You've left your daughter behind, and you're dying over and over again, but you love it. Obviously, so Hades, I think part of that game's success is that it sort of successfully found a framing where the narrative progression was outside of the run. It was you do the run, then back at base the narrative progresses, and in some situations what you do in the run is, affects what progress you can make back in the narrative. But for the most part, there's lots of different threads to it and lots of different conditionalities. But a lot of it is just going to tick along. If you just keep playing, you just keep dying, you'll keep forging through the story. And that was a smart move, I think, to make you if you win, you haven't solved the narrative, you haven't finished it. That's just one step along the path. And B, if you don't win, it's rather than feeling like, oh God, I'm just back to square one, you feel like the story may progress as well as your character being upgraded and everything. And then Invisible Ink is the one that makes most sense to me, I think, because it's sort of like XCOM in the sense that it's a campaign with a context and a goal, and it's long enough. It's sort of, I feel like an Invisible Ink campaign is like 8-10 hours maybe. And at the end of that, if you won, I can totally understand people not wanting to start again, because it's sort of like an XCOM campaign. You win XCOM, you don't necessarily immediately want to restart XCOM. Unlike a Spelunky run, which is 30 minutes long, and you die and you think, shit, I can do better next time, let me do it again. So yeah, that one makes sense. And I think run length is important, and then the story framing of like, can you make progress in the story outside of the run? I think putting the story outside of the run is a smart move.
Yeah, I think in Spelunky's example as well, I think there are quite a lot of players who were playing to discover the story. There's obviously the lore stuff that's actually baked into Spelunky 2, like in a way that it isn't HD. Like my son just kept telling me lots of things about who the shopkeepers really are and that kind of thing.
Oh, really?
Which is sort of, wow, okay, I had no idea that's where Derek was going with all this.
It's
but
blown the lid off the whole thing.
Yeah. And so that was actually one of the things that was drawing him through. Like, he's very story-led, my son, so actually mechanics aren't as interesting to him as getting to see new places and figuring out where they fit within the game's sort of history and world.
That's the thing Spelunky definitely does well. Obviously there is no out of run in Spelunky. There's kind of in Spelunky 2 there's a sort of a home base and some characters there, but story progression doesn't happen there really. And so the story, even if you win Spelunky in the conventional sense, there's a lot you haven't seen, and there's secrets still to discover. And those secrets, the whole thing is very light on story. But if there is any story, it's in those secrets, right? It's kind of like even back when it was, it's always been fairly arbitrary series of non sequiturs in terms of like, the key fits the chest, that makes sense. Then there's a weird eye in there, and the eye lets you see. It doesn't let you see anything actually. It just lets you hear the black market, and then the black market, and so on and so on. And there's a lot of interactions there where you would never guess it, short of just either looking up on the wiki or, well, I've found this weird thing and there's only one other thing I know about, so let's bring it to there and see if anything happens. And Spelunky 2, it's more story-ish, and I know a lot of Spelunky 2's secrets in particular are based on legends that have real world lore to them. But I wouldn't say that is how I wouldn't say that investigating the secrets is a case of unfolding a story, or that you progress in the story by understanding that lore, because I actually did the opposite, where I was sent down a total red herring path because I looked up the bow. I can't remember the name. It's the bow of and then someone's name, and that is a real legend. And I looked up the legend, and it has a very particular thing that happens in that legend, and I could think of a way to enact that within Spelunky's framework, and I went and did it, and it has no effect. It's completely irrelevant.
There's probably something to argue, and I think this is what my son actually did. Once he'd discovered a lot of these secrets, that's when his interest actually came, peeled away. He played Spelunky HD for longer, and I think that's because it was a bit sparer, but there was more mystery to it in some ways, because it didn't actually explain anything in that way.
Right.
For him, I think he plays games in a very specific way.
Well, I think to that point, like roguelikes aren't that different to other kinds of open-ended games or sandbox games when it comes to the way that you piece together your understanding of the world. Like the time reset or kind of death reset system is quite specific, and obviously if you're telling a story about a particular character, or you're expecting kind of continuity of experience, and obviously you end up telling a time loop story of one kind or another, whatever kind of genre is layered on top of that. But more broadly, like they are a good way of encouraging you to become very familiar with a particular set of environments and creatures, and learn to pay close attention to the way those creatures behave and what that might mean, and start to intuit the history of the world from that. And I don't think that's actually that dissimilar to something like a sandbox game or Minecraft or something like that, where you start to, maybe Minecraft's not a great example for this, but where you start, just because, even though it's not strictly a roguelike, you're still encountering and re-encountering archetypal situations over and over again, encouraged to kind of pull similar or different information out of them every time, and there's some ambiguity there which prompts further investigation and experimentation. And I think that's quite a good way of unfolding the story of a world, really, through a game like this, or through any game, to be honest. And I can kind of understand why Jack's experience was the way it was based on that, right? That like Spelunky 1, it's the same mechanic, it just maybe doesn't have answers, and that can be compelling in its own way.
Yeah. I think it also helped him focus on actually with the real meat of the game, which is the game. And I think that Splunky 2, he got very focused on, there's a new place I can go, and there's another new place I can go, and he actually started to focus on the novelty more than he did the pure game. I mean, it's difficult to say because obviously he was playing a game that was very familiar, and he'd already proved himself and understood the fundamentals of Splunky. It's difficult to say, but so maybe I'm being tempted to a little bit too much to think that story played a role in the fact that he didn't play Splunky 2 for as long as Splunky 1.
I think maybe there's just a difference. Like, it's interesting that you draw out novelty there, because I think like if that is the kind of the value proposition of entering a new area to a player, that it's necessarily going to put a limit on their investment in the game, right? Like, they're going to hit a point where there is nothing new to see.
Exactly.
And the great strength of a roguelike is the promise of different combinations of elements. And I don't necessarily, and that's what creates like interesting mechanical challenges or gameplay situations or whatever. I don't necessarily can think of a game off the top of my head that has achieved that in an interesting way with narrative, where you might see elements in a different combination that opens up some pathway for you in terms of your understanding of the world. But that would probably be the next step, right? The way to kind of extend that longevity further. I think Splunky 1 achieves what it achieves in that regard because it doesn't have any answers.
Yeah.
But that is also limiting in long term in terms of what it could potentially say or the way it could potentially reward that investment.
Yeah.
So Griftlands is a really interesting example here. Clay's game, which is a roguelike deck builder that is very story driven, and each run is you are playing. There's 3 characters. Each character has their own story that you play through. They're very different, but it is a story. You're trying to defeat this person who wronged you in the past, and at the end of it, you defeat them. And so I'd be curious if this questioner, once they've done that if they'd be done with that character. And Griftlands sort of still caters to you there, I think, because it will take you quite a few runs to accomplish that. And even once you've got 2 more characters to then play their own stories, and those are totally different. But it was a bad mix for me. I do like the game, but ultimately I came away from it thinking you probably wouldn't make a Griftlands 2, in this template. If you were going to make another game like this, you'd adapt, I think, because for me, it hits the exact problem it hits up against the reason why people don't do this, why you don't make a very story-driven roguelike, is because you're going to play a roguelike a lot of different times, and story the second time through is less interesting. And it takes a good stab at branching and mixing up elements. It's got this idea of like each character has an attitude to you, and then they can just be like, dislike, hate, love, and those confer mechanical perks to you or debuffs. And those people can be present like in a bar, so that when you have a fight with somebody else, if some of the other people in the bar already like you, they'll join in, and that will affect the fight. And that stuff it's there. It doesn't end up being primary for me, and it's also hard to control. You often if you're fighting somebody out in the wilderness and it's who they are and they have friends and who their friends are, it's if you spare them when you defeat them, then they run back and tell their friends and they hate you, and if you kill them, then their friend hates you for killing them. So kind of it ends up being like, well, either way, it's just like somebody hates me. I don't really I'm not really piloting the story here. I'm just kind of like making quite arbitrary decisions. So for me, it wasn't a great mix, and it definitely didn't do the thing of pulling the narrative outside of the run. The narrative lives inside the run.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. If you could, Tom Pickford, the writer of the that question, if you could play Griftlands, Griftlands.
Alex, you're right. You're all right. Are we ending
of the New York Griftlands?
Yeah.
If you do play Griftlands and you want to let us know how you do approach his story, that'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah,
but otherwise, I think that's the 365th.
That's the full year. Wow, what a long.
It's almost as if there's one for every day of the year.
I don't know if
what a year that would be.
I don't know if RTX Voice just cancelled the raspberry I just blew. I think it might have
that
done.
Came through.
Oh, good. Good.
It's actually it's a bit like the Xbox 360, but it's 5 out.
Oh,
it's like a belt.
I wonder if the RTX AI is smart enough to fix this. I don't think it
No one
is.
can fix this.
To
No,
fix your friends.
that's all the grifflins we've got time for. If you'd like to send us your musings on video games, be they grifflins or otherwise, you can do so by emailing us at questions@crateandcrowbar.com. You can also tweet us at crateandcrowbar. Will we check? I don't know, and I'll never tell. If you'd like to support the podcast on Patreon, as several of you already do, thank you very much for your support. You can find out more about that, patreon.com/crateandcrowbar. We've got a website, crateandcrowbar.com, where you'll find episodes much like this one. A year's worth, you might say. More than that, actually, if you count all of the lock-ins and specials and spin-offs and other things. More than a year. By about 2 weeks, probably, let's say. What am I talking about? Oh, yeah, Discord. There's a link on it, definitely. There's a link on the website. You click that, loads Discord, join that. There's friends. Hooray. If you want to find a video with a podcast in it, youtube.com. If you want to find videos with this podcast in it, youtube.com/crateandcrowbar. It's the world's second most popular website. I've been Chris Thurston.
I've been Tom Francis.
I've been Alex Wilshire.
Yeah!
I win!
And I've been Graham Smith.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Everybody.